Welcome to the Lorecast. I'm Dr. Craig Chalkwist, and we're looking at the stories by which we deeply live. Once upon a time, many years ago, I used to run batterer intervention groups for men who had committed violent crimes and done jail or prison time, got out, and came to our centers as part of their sentencing. And it wasn't long before I noticed a couple of interesting trends. One was that all of the men in our groups were highly emotionally immature, which was no surprise. I would say that most of them were anywhere between 5 and perhaps 12 emotionally. And that was consistent. That was everybody pretty much. The second thing I noticed was more along political lines. We occasionally had men who were left-leaning, but the majority of the men in our groups were on the right. And not just conservative, which is a misleading word in some ways. These were all authoritarians. They had what Eric Fromm and others would call the authoritarian personality. When they talked about politics, their idea was that there should be a strong man leading everybody else, and that obedience was a primary virtue. So this was the majority of men in our groups, and of that group, the majority were Christians, considered themselves Christians. So as the United States falls ever deeper under the influence of authoritarian politics, it seemed like a good idea to explore what this means and what some of the underlying stories are. Because religion and authoritarianism have a lot to do with each other, but they aren't really the same. Another way of saying this is that although they aren't the same, monotheistic religion, and Christianity in particular, when it's held a certain way, is a setup, a conditioning for authoritarianism. Now, this is especially true when Christianity is held in a very literalist, fundamentalist way, and God is only thought of as a father figure, just like the strong authoritarian father, that everyone obeys the same code book, women are to be subservient, there are only two rigidly defined sexes, and education must be biblical. That's Christian authoritarianism. It's usually violent, which is why we saw so much of it in our groups, in our domestic violence perpetrators. We're almost all of this political persuasion. And it also explains why so many women were triggered during the Trump campaign, the second one. In July of 2024, I did a series of TikTok videos on this that got quite a few views. And I heard from a lot of women who said, no wonder I was being so triggered by this election. People told me I was overreacting. No, you weren't overreacting. Your body was reminding you what it's like having a male perpetrator, have power over you. It was an appropriate reaction. And now, of course, the Trump government is basically a haven for sexual predators. That's something worth reacting to. And it's set up that way on purpose. It's not like it's hidden or anything. It's an intimidation tactic. And that's part of this mixture too. Men who perpetrate against women perpetrate abuse and violence. Authoritarians who perpetrate against entire populations are bullies. And they rule through fear and control, punishment, and retaliation. They're like a negative dad. And so the dad god of the Bible, when taken in certain ways, taken literally especially, becomes the dad god who rules a nation. Now, at this point, a lot of people say, well, it's religion that's the problem. That's what's going on here if we just get rid of religion. A couple of things about that. First of all, it's unlikely that we'll ever get rid of religion because it shows up in every single human culture, either overtly, which is usually the case, or kind of smuggled in. But it always shows up. You go all the way back through history, and everywhere you look, you see religion. It clearly serves important purposes. So that's one consideration. Another is patriarchal religion is only very historically recent when you consider the entire span of human life on this planet. It's only been around a few thousand years compared to 200,000 that we've been walking around on the earth. So it's fairly recent. And even within the patriarchal and monotheistic religions, there are many ways to hold those that don't involve being an authoritarian bully. We probably all know examples of this. I certainly do. Priests and pastors who are genuinely spiritual people, caring people. Sometimes the mystics are evoked here, but we have to be careful with that because oftentimes the mystics, for the most part actually, are solidly within their tradition. So we can see, for instance, from the letters of Catherine of Siena, Hildegard of Bingen, they were all for the Crusades. And that's actually fairly common. Thomas Merton never left the Catholic Church, even though he had nightmares about it. He drank while he was in the monastery. He still wouldn't leave. So the mystics aren't the best place to go. Usually the real spiritual progressives leave. They go elsewhere because it's too confining. Which is not to say that all these people I just mentioned didn't do good spiritual work. Sure they did. They're just not exemplars of rising above the system. There are plenty of mystics who have supported authoritarian bullies in many different religions. Religious authoritarianism seems to be particularly violent and virulent. And one point that's raised sometimes is, well, what about Mussolini and Hitler? They weren't Christians. They were raised Catholic, actually. So they got the imprint of the dad god, the imprint of the father who rules with an iron fist. That was something they soaked up while they grew up. And these go together. Think about in places, joyless American colonies, how violent they were. There were theocracies. And as for the Pilgrims, they didn't come over to the United States seeking religious freedom. They came over to seek the freedom to rule over their own people and keep them in line. That's why they came here. There are also financial reasons, but religiously, that's why they came here. As Carl Jung pointed out, when you have a father complex, and all the men in my groups had one, they often got along with their mothers okay, more or less, but they all had abusive fathers. So when you have a father complex, it tends to take on a dual aspect, the figure of the father, because it's split. That's what abuse does. It splits the father image in the psyche. So you have the all-good, perfect, omnipotent father on the one hand, and the violent, dark father on the other. And you see this throughout the Bible, which I've read carefully, and certain passages many more times than once. The Bible portrays God as either a cosmic bully who murders people in impulsive fits of rage, or more along the lines of the God of Jesus and some of the Hebrew prophets who is loving. It tends to be one or the other. God doesn't tend to be neutral in the Bible, which is why I think the Bible in many ways is a trauma document. Many of the people who contributed to it were severely oppressed, and it shows. And one of their ways of dealing with it was to write in the book. So it mystifies some people that the biblical God is such a God of extremes. At one point, God says, I am a man of war. At another point, God is merciful. But this is how a father complex works. And this is how habitually violent and abusive men work. On the one hand, they're threatening, whether directly or by innuendo. They have bad tempers. They're controlling. They say horrible things about women. They emotionally castrate other men with their bullying. They're notorious in their own families. Their family members tiptoe around them. And on the other hand, they're also some of the most loving people you will ever meet, which is very confusing to the victims. Years ago, when my dad was going through protracted death from vascular dementia, at one point he had a stroke. And the doctor told my mother and me that this is a left frontal lobe stroke, so he might be pretty mean and paranoid when he wakes up. And we both laughed because he was mean and paranoid anyway. He was very abusive. And every now and then you'd see that other side of him, the kinder side, but often not. Because another quality of authoritarians is that they themselves are ruled by fear, and so they try to rule by fear. They're constantly scared, including the fear of not being enough of a man in the toxic masculine sense. So the stroke actually had a very different effect on my dad. It stripped away some of the rage and pain and fear, and it left him rather childlike. So I remember walking into his room once to see how he was doing, and he was staring in awe at a beam of sunlight coming in through the window. And he said something like, "Isn't it beautiful?" And he would listen to the birds chirp and other things that he had probably heard a million times and never noticed. And so all this happened a few weeks before he died, and I like to think that we got a glimpse of the real him underneath everything, all the abuse, all the authoritarianism, because that person is there. And it's actually one of the things that gives me faith in human nature, because I've often seen that in violent men. And it's also one of the things that makes them so hard to leave. But the fact is that no amount of codependency, no amount of servility, patience, any of those things can really summon forth that other side when it's encrusted with too much rage and hatred and defense. So I hope nobody hearing this will say, but they have a chance. If they have a chance, it's through professional intervention. And that actually can make a difference. I'm a big believer in men being forced into therapy once they've been violent. I've seen many of them transform that way, but they can't be transformed by just kindness. It tends to make them even more contemptuous. Confirms for them that bullying is the way to go. It's the way to have control and to get what you want. My maternal grandmother on the birth family side was a veritable saint who treated my grandfather much better than he ever deserved to be treated. He was very abusive. And they eventually divorced. And then my grandfather, probably unconsciously, made a really good marriage. And I got to see the results of that shortly before he died. I visited him after having not known him growing up. And he married a very strong woman who wouldn't put up with any nonsense. And she had let him know that right at the start of the relationship, because abusive men often see how much they can get away with. They'll start pushing right from the very beginning, and you have to push back. So she did. And as a result, he treated her nicely. He pulled her chair out for her and was courteous. And afterwards, I was talking to my family about it, and I said, "Do you think all that was for show?" They said, "Oh no, he doesn't care what people think." No, that was real. He actually changed as a result of being held accountable for his misbehavior. And that's the way we get through this. One way we get through this is by, when subjected to authoritarian bullying, we all pull together, we all support each other, and we demand that there be consequences for the misbehavior. Now, this is hard to do when the authoritarians own the courts and the judges, and they have a circle of enablers. They're over the army and all the rest of it. But even so, it's helpful to keep in mind that what they're trying to project is an all-powerful image that inevitably has holes in it. There will always be people who resist, always be holdouts, always be people who see that the emperor has no clothes, that there's a lot more of us than there are of him and his supporters. On an even deeper level, the presence of bullies, religious bullies, political bullies, whoever, bullies at work, their presence says something needs to be confronted. And the bullies usually exemplify the things that are going on in us at a lesser intensity. So we may have some racism going, we may have some sexism, some homophobia going, lack of acceptance of each other. The bully comes along and amplifies that. He gives us the funhouse mirror version by showing what it looks like 100 times larger. And then we have to confront it. So although authoritarian bullies cause an enormous amount of damage and loss of life and abuse and terror, they also bring the possibility of renewal if we can face them, see through them, survive them, get together and realize through the image of this authoritarian, this is exactly what we don't want and don't need. This is exactly what we have to be done with. And eventually, even those who support the authoritarian are forced to realize this person's bad news. I should never have supported this. There were a lot of people in Nazi Germany who, after the war, had that kind of awakening moment of saying, wow, and I was on the side of that. So another way of thinking about authoritarians is that they're like a storm that blows at maximum intensity for a while because of the imbalances in the atmosphere. But then eventually the imbalances blow themselves out, the storm decreases, and allows new things to grow. Whereas before there was only destruction and mayhem. In my science fiction, I talk a lot about not progress, but how humanity comes of age, and it's through struggle. It's a long, 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 difficult adventure. But if we take the larger view and realize that setbacks occur on that very long road, then perhaps it can strengthen us a little bit for the harder parts of that journey. As we get together and imagine, what would a fully mature humanity really look like and be like and act like?